Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. While much of America and the world keeps getting crushed by inflation, you are profiting from it. I provide you with a housing market update. Then, as higher inflation reduces the quality of life for so many world residents, today's guest gives us both a global and national perspective on the prospects for a depression today on Get Rich Education. GRE listeners can't stop talking about their service from Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They've provided our tribe with more loans than anyone. They're truly a top lender for beginners and veterans. It's where I go to get my own loans for single-family rental property up to fourplexes. So start your pre-qualification and you can chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. They'll even deliver your custom plan for growing your real estate portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com. You know, a lot of investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market could provide both: Jacksonville, Florida. They've got 27% lower home prices and higher rents than the national median. Their market has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and above average appreciation for tomorrow. They often have available inventory in Jacksonville, if you can believe that. Start at cashflowandgrowth.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from NYC's Brooklyn Bridge to Bainbridge Island, Washington, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. This is GRE, and it's episode 401. No, it's definitely not episode 401k. No life deferral plans here. Excuse me. They're called tax deferral plans, though life deferral plans would be a more apropos moniker. I'm grateful that you're here for another wealth building week. Now, asking an angry spouse to calm down is not exactly a tactic that's effective. Well, by now, Jerome Powell has been effective at raising interest rates, though, to help America's housing market calm down. Although mortgage rates have inched lower in recent weeks, they're still 2% higher now than they were a year ago today. In fact, the rate rise from early March to early May of this year, that was the swiftest that I've ever seen in my entire life. Rates scaled a wall, and clearly this impacts affordability. The rate of property sales is a little lower now off its peak. It's getting more Darwinian out there. The NAR estimates that 15% of wannabe first-time homebuyers, they're going to be priced out of the market this year. But people have to live somewhere. If they can't own, then they're going to have to rent. Or they can keep living in their parents' basement. That's an option for some people too. Right now, the home ownership rate is 65%. And that 65% figure is pretty close to the average of the past few American generations. But I'll tell you, that 65% home ownership rate is poised to fall even faster than Dogecoin. Well, what this likely falling home ownership rate would mean is that the renter pool should swell, it should grow larger, and that puts more upward pressure on rents. That's what happens. So if this home ownership rate goes from 65% down to 60%, then America's renter population basically goes from 35% up to 40%. You know how I've talked about how home prices rise first and then rent increases lag behind that? Well, this is it. This is the place and time where rents can catch up. With housing prices, though, are we set up for a recipe of housing crash, or is it more like housing calm? Well, looking at purchase applications, demand appears past its peak. But housing demand still drastically exceeds supply by far. The normal housing supply, it's about 1.5 million units. That available inventory Well, we've come up from a jaw-dropping paucity, this dearth of just 376,000 available homes back in February, and now with the latest reading, it's just 516,000. Yeah, so just a 500,000, where the normal housing supply is about 1.5 million housing units in the United States. So we are only up a tad from famine-like levels of supply. America still needs about 300% more inventory just to bring the market back somewhat into supply-demand imbalance. Housing supply is inelastic. It cannot be increased quickly. It is going to take years in order to reach a balance. Now, how else can we measure this balance? Well, one way is with days on market. Pre-pandemic, it was 45 days, which is pretty close to normal. And now, despite higher interest rates, it's under 30 days and it's under 20 days in a lot of markets. Mortgage delinquencies have fallen for 7 straight quarters now. The forbearance program worked, and one can certainly critique its morality or its fairness, but it did keep people from losing their homes. So as the market entropy with wild bidding wars and a free-for-all, well, that condition could not last forever, nor was it good that that condition persist. It is still a strong housing market with multiple offers, but expect a gradual return to a calmer, more normalized condition. And I think this reversion to calm, that's really the right word. Yeah, calmer market conditions poised to emerge here. And you know what that means? Hey, pretty soon you might not have to offer more than the list price for a property. You could have less competition from all cash buyers. And come on, sheesh, all cash buyers? What are those zero leverage psychos doing anyway? Hey, property inspections are coming back. Imagine that you can ask a seller to fix some things for you and not fear that they're going to reject your offer. So what really is then the bottom line with today's housing market? It's that rents should keep rising faster than historic norms. Supply is still so low that housing price crash prospects are near zero, probably even through 2023, and that 20% annual price increases still do exist in many markets, but nationally this is calming now. And by the end of the year, home price appreciation is still going to be higher than the historic norm of 5%. That's what I'd expect. And you know, back on December 1st of last year, I published GRE's 2022 National Median Housing Price Forecast, and I also announced it on this show at that time that I expected a 9% to 10% rate of home price appreciation this year. Well, we're nearly at mid-year here, and I still like how that forecast looks. In America, you've heard of the Great Resignation, or maybe the Great Migration, but I think that the term that best encapsulates what's happened in American housing since really the start of this decade is the Great Reshuffling. Working from home, that was a significant driver of this Great Reshuffling, and that accounted for more than half of the steep increases in home prices that were seen during the pandemic. In fact, that's what new research uncovered by the National Bureau of Economic Research. By now, you've got more Americans that are shuffled into place, that found that long-term home with the realities of their new life. That's really the bottom line. There is a great reshuffling, and now people are settling into place. So we're kind of seeing this welcome calming of the housing market as we move toward eventually settling into more normal conditions. Well, hey, thank you for that instant reaction from so many of you after last week's milestone episode 400, where Hal Elrod and I discussed how to improve relationships and be a person of value. Greg from the United States remarked, 2 of my favorite people were together in one episode. I've been following Keith since the beginning of his podcast and journey, and I love the miracle morning and practice it habitually. Roxana from Romania said, this was just phenomenal, a terrific talk that I listened to 3 times already. Thank you for all the good that you do through GRE. Congratulations for 400 episodes. Oh, I really appreciate the remarks there. Thanks. I want to hear from you, the listener. If you've been following along here and you've acted by putting income property into your portfolio and you're now the beneficiary of inflation and you're profiting from this inflation with the inflation triple crown, from time to time, we'd like to have a listener right here on the show with me. If that interests you, reach out to us through getricheducation.com/contact. There's no guarantee that we can get you on the show here. We already have about 50 times as many requests to appear on the show as available slots. But if you've had your life impacted, we want to hear from you. You don't need to be a big name. In fact, if you're just sort of a salary or wage earning person that's had their life impacted by taking GRE principles and putting them into action, then I really want to hear from you. Again, get started there. Reach out. Tell us your scenario at getricheducation.com/contact. Inflation flips money upside down. Although inflation is not a news story, a lot of experts believe that inflation is going to stay elevated for a longer period of time here. So it's important that you harness it to flip it over and actually profit from it. And I think that some people, everyday people, they let themselves be coerced by inflation. So they cut back on grocery spending and complain about car gasoline prices and maybe even lament that their 401k is plummeting. So they end up living a small life and maybe even a miserable life. And there's this increasingly popular narrative that's been building for years and probably even decades that seems to enforce that, well, you'll do with less and you'll be happy about it. And you hear more buzzy terms like, well, reducing your standard of living, that's just what sustainable looks like. Don't you want to live sustainably? And people will try to conserve gasoline consumption by biking in the rain and having a muddy streak up their back. Now, all things equal, I think if you want to do something like that for the environment, that can be good. That's fine. Rather than sustainability, some people try to mask the quality of life degradation from inflation, justifying it with, well, I'm just practicing minimalism over here. Minimalism. Yeah, I don't need to go on vacations. And the translation for that is, I'm too fearful of my financial security to even get out and see the very world that I live in. And they're not thinking differently and they're not acting differently than this old world save money and retire debt mindset. Whoever said that less is more never had more. And why have more when you can have it all? Okay, I can hear a little bit with that one, but if you keep your quality of life intact because you invested in real assets with good debt, well, then go ahead and recycle some more of those consumable items in your household if you want to help the environment. Sure, but you don't get to recycle your life. You've only got one of those, at least here on this earth. Today's guest believes that the prospect of a greater depression lies ahead. Let's explore this together, you and I, today. This week's guest is the founder of Casey Research. He's the author of the High Ground series of novels. He's also authored multiple New York Times best-selling books, often around the topic of crisis investing. He produces the show Doug Casey's Take and a daily blog at internationalman.com. I'd like to welcome back to GRE the international man himself, Doug Casey.
Thank you, Keith. I'm speaking to you from the quiet but peaceful little country of Uruguay.
That peaceful, small South American nation there. Doug, back here in the United States, where I am and where so many of our listeners are, economically, it's a really interesting time. We had you here about 6 months ago to talk about ideals like freedom and liberty. And today, you and I are exploring the economy, and we're in these interesting economic times where we have high inflation, fast rising interest rates, war in Europe, which is really affecting the availability of the world's wheat and fertilizer fertilizer. And are we in a good economy? I kind of wonder. I think some people can point to something like, well, the unemployment rate's below 4%, so I guess the economy's good. Me as an American and a consumer, if I want to get a new car, oftentimes I find myself, I'd have to wait 6 to 12 months in order to get that car. And I still see empty shelves on grocery stores, and maybe I can't get fresh avocados if I want them. That's not very economically viable if it affects my quality of living and my standard of life there. So talk to us about the state of economic health, especially in America today, Doug.
We've entered upon what I term the Greater Depression. We entered upon that several years ago. Let's define the word depression. It's a period of time when most people's standard of living drops significantly. Now, the depression that I'm talking about, I expect is going to be very persistent. It's going to be very different than what happened from 1929 to 1946, much longer lasting than what happened then, and much worse also. People have noticed higher gasoline, higher food prices, all this type of thing. But it's just a portent of what's to come. Why do I say that? Because the government has a huge effect on what happens to the economy. It's gone from perhaps 5% of the economy at the beginning of the 20th century to really about 50% now. So everything that happens is based on politics, and that's a very, very bad thing. The most recent evidence of this is when the American people, in their wisdom, well, they don't have any wisdom. They're actually quite stupid. It's like Einstein said, after hydrogen, the most common thing in the universe is stupidity. So they elected actual Bolsheviks, actual Jacobins to office in 2020. And I say that because the people that are in control in Washington now have exactly the same psychology and exactly the same political philosophies as the people that led the revolutions in France in 1789, and for that matter, Russia in 1917, and a number of other things. So this argues very, very badly for the economy. And you mentioned a couple of numbers, Keith, like 4% unemployment. These numbers are only marginally more trustworthy than the numbers that the Argentine government puts out.
Yeah.
I mean, they're fudged, they're manipulated, they're put out for political purposes. So no, we're in for some very, very rough running, and it's just started. See, things actually seem so much better right now than they really are, among other things, because the government has created trillions of dollars of new currency units just in the last few years. That puts us in a fool's paradise, because it's just as if tomorrow morning or tonight we deposited $100,000 in everybody's bank account. Everybody wake up tomorrow morning and say, that's great, $100,000 more. I'm wealthy. I'm going to buy a Ferrari or whatever. So you'd feel rich for the moment. But the consequences of that ought to be obvious if everybody got $100,000 in their bank account. Well, we did something similar to that over the last few years. So I guess that's kind of my opening statement to reply what you said.
Well, there's an awful lot there with the Greater Depression, and that makes one think about standard of life for just everyday consumer items. For example, things like scarcity in energy and scarcity in food. I know that you have some pretty strong opinions about food riots with higher inflation, with a higher cost in one's everyday sustenance. This is really important stuff. Oftentimes, I think about these sorts of things, maybe a food riot transpiring in a developing nation, whether that's Tajikistan or Mauritania or the Philippines or Mali or wherever it might be, before coming to the United States. Oftentimes you think of consumer spending in some of those developing nations like that. You might have a person that spends 70% of their income on food. So if food prices double, you can see how that's a problem and how that would create a riot. Here in America, I don't know what percent of my income I spend on food. Maybe it's only 5%. If that doubled, I could weather it. It might lower my quality of life somewhat. But what are your thoughts about food riots? Are we seeing more of this with increasing inflation and a decreased supply of everyday consumer goods?
I trade commodities, among other things. And generally speaking, the cost of food on a raw material basis is about doubled. I mean, the price of wheat has gone from $5 to $10. Price of soybeans, 8 to 16, more or less. Corn, 4 to 8. So this is going to be reflected right down the line in a lot of ways. And the cost of natural gas, for instance, which is critical to not only people heating their homes, but to making fertilizers and plastics, has about quadrupled. Although I've got to say, even now, natural gas in the United States, even though it's close to the highest level that we've ever had here, is only a quarter of world levels. So there's a lot of room left to run. Price of oil is trading at $110 a barrel. Just recently, we were used to oil in the $30, maybe $40 a barrel. There's going to be knock-on effects all the way around. But you're quite correct. It's in these third world countries. In many cases, I don't even call them developing countries. I've been to 155, 160 countries, something on that order. Most of them, many times. I've lived in 12 countries. And at this point, I've got to tell you, I'm not sure that developing countries is even the right term.
It's a genteel term.
They're backward, and they're getting more backward. They're sliding downhill, especially the poor people in these countries that can barely keep body and soul together. So as all these prices go up, the cost of their cooking oil, the cost of their rice, their beans, their gasoline that they need for their little handheld tractors to plow their acre ground, it's become quite nasty for them. And I'm afraid it's going to get much worse. Earlier, you mentioned we live in interesting times. And I'm sure you recall that is said to be an old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And they're going to be very interesting, starting the rest of this year, next year, the year after. And it's going to go on for quite a while. So hold on to your hat. We've already seen the stock market basically fall out of bed. I mean, a lot of stocks, the kind of meme stocks that the Robinhood people have been buying, many are down 50%, 80%, 90%. But it can get much, much worse. I can give you lots of historical examples of that. And I know that a lot of your listeners are interested in real estate. I've been very actively involved in the real estate business for many years. I'm a bear on real estate as well. The only good thing about real estate right now is that at least you're getting out of the dollar. At least you're getting into a tangible asset with real estate. That's the good news. But the bad news is in the United States anyway. This is not true everywhere in the world, but it's true in the United States and Canada, that the real estate market floats on a sea of debt, and interest rates are at close to still all-time lows. I think they're going to have to go back to all-time highs. Why do I say that? Because retail price increases are running 10 to 15% per year. That's the real number, not the government's phony number, okay? People that lend money, people that buy bonds, say, wait a minute, I'm getting 2%, 3%, maybe 5%. I'm losing 10% per year.
They're locking in a loss in prosperity.
That's exactly right. There's going to be a waterfall of selling in bonds. And what does that mean? Interest rates are going way up. That's what happens when bond prices go down, interest rates are up. And it's going to be very hard to finance houses in the U.S. at the kind of interest rates we're going to see. And in the U.S., if you can't borrow money, you can't buy or sell a house today. The prices, even while the dollar is losing value, we have the paradox of a lot of real estate is going to go down in price even while the dollar is losing value. That sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. These things happen in markets.
Real estate, typically a good place to be in inflationary times. You also have that astounding dearth of housing supply helping to underwrite that market. But Doug, to your point earlier about calling some of these places developing nations, maybe we should call them unraveling nations. And I'm not trying to use a pejorative term toward other nations because maybe America is one of those unraveling nations as well. So as we descend into what you call a greater depression, I'd like to build some more context on how you think that looks and what the milestones are between today, a greater depression. Maybe that includes stagflation. Stagflation being the etymology of that word is it's a portmanteau of stagnant, a stagnant economy with inflation. Is that one of the milestones on the way to this greater depression that you described, Doug?
Sure. Stagflation is what they have in exaggerated form in places like Zimbabwe, where I've spent a lot of time, incidentally, and Venezuela, where I've also spent a lot of time over the years. The currency loses value at an accelerating rate, and asset prices drop along with the standard of living. That's what we're looking at here in the US. But there's more. We talk about these third world countries. As things get bad in third world countries because of higher food and fuel prices squeezing people at the bottom, there's going to be mass migration all over the world. We're already seeing that across the Rio Grande. They say that about 2 million people are crossing the Rio Grande into the US every year. I guess those people are put up with free food, free cell phones, free money, free education, free medical, but that could go much higher. We could be getting 3 or 4 million people piling into the US. And this is a very destabilizing influence where you have all these poor people of a vastly different culture wandering around with nothing to do, being supported publicly. The same thing is going to happen in Europe, incidentally. It has happened already, but it's going to accelerate where you're going to have millions, tens of millions, eventually, of people, feet people, boat people, coming up from Africa and across from the Middle East to Europe, because they realize standard of living higher, free stuff. I'm getting out of the war zones where I'm living on a plot of sand with nothing to eat. We're looking at mass social upheaval in the years to come. And a lot of it's due to the economic chaos created by these governments. And what's really created the chaos is they're printing currency units by the trillions, which, as I said, is going to also destroy the mortgage market. And you destroy the mortgage market in the US, you destroy the real estate market as well. Hold on to your hat.
America is a fragile place. I talked about an unraveling before. We're in a really precarious place where people commonly get cars with 7-year financing. Now, maybe that's a good idea for some people if you can arbitrage a fixed 3% car interest loan rate. But I'm talking about people that can only afford a car if they stretch out their financing. I mean, it's been said that half of America has no savings at all. Instead, they have loads of all kinds of debt, mortgage and credit card and auto and student loan debt. I mean, if those people need to lay their hands on an extra $500 or $1,000, they can't do it. America is fragile that way.
Yes, we see lots of people living on the streets in major cities, living under bridges. In the future, as they lose their jobs, because they've been working in unsustainable industries. I hate to use the word unsustainable. It's become so PC and popular. But there have been a lot of distortions caused in the economy because of the money creation, where people have been doing things that they otherwise couldn't, where they've been basically living above their means, either by borrowing capital that other people have saved in the past, that's what debt does, or mortgaging their future. That's the nature of debt. That's why debt is bad and savings are good. Few people have savings today. Okay, where do we go from here? What do we do from here? I own a nice house in the US. I've got a farm here, or I've got other stuff. But I don't consider these things as investments. I consider them as expensive consumer goods. In other words, like a car. A car is not an investment. It's a consumer good, although a very expensive one today. And just as an interesting factet, when I was a kid and I wanted a car, believe it or not, I mean, some of your listeners will hark back to this era. Hey, you saved up for a car and then you bought a crappy used car. That's right. The way it worked. And then later, they had 2-year financing for cars. A lot of people jumped into the 3 years, 5 years, now it's 7 years. It's crazy to take out a loan on a depreciating asset because eventually your asset's going down in value while the value of your loan or the amount of your loan is going up. In fact, even when people buy a car with 7-year payments, at least they have an asset, not a very good one, but most people are actually leasing cars right now. So instead of at least a crappy asset, you've got an immediate liability. We're heading for big trouble on all levels. You mentioned student loans earlier, and the government is talking about forgiving student loans. Well, this impresses me as completely insane. Why should the average taxpayer pay off the loans of people that A, made the very bad decision of going to college, and the people that do go to college tend to be from the upper economic strata, so the poor guy's paying off the rich guy's debt? The answer to the question is don't go to college today. It's a waste of time and money in most cases. And the people that have made that mistake, well, you know what? Actions have consequences. So you're going to have to pay your debt off. On the bright side, the dollar is losing value so quickly that these loans will basically all be destroyed.
Yes, it does help debase debtors' debt with that weakening dollar. Well, Doug and I have more to talk about on the road toward a greater depression. That's next when we come back. You're listening to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. For accredited investors, if you've ever wanted 10 to 12% passive income returns, Wagner and Alasko and his professional partners could have the right answer for you with real estate, one of the safest assets available on the planet. On a preferred return basis, you collect your money before anyone else does. I encourage you, go ahead, learn more about their opportunities at I'mAccredited.com or text 305-684-2222 for your free investment guide. Hey, my friend Damian Lupo informed me that checkbook IRAs have been made illegal by the U.S. tax court. If you have a checkbook IRA, your holdings are now disqualified with taxes and penalties up to 50%. But don't panic, Damian and the EQRP company can fix this. Those IRAs can be converted into EQRPs retroactive to last year, getting those tax deductions and reducing your taxable income. In this way, you can invest your 401k or IRA in real estate, Bitcoin, gold, and even your own business. So whether you're a full-time investor or retired or even a dentist with dozens of employees, if you're listening, you qualify, the EQRP works. It's a solution. You'll control your money, kill UBIT, and pay way less taxes. To learn more about this strategy and free up your retirement money, get the newest EQRP special report. Text GRE to 307-213-3475. That's text GRE to 307-213-3475.
This is Richard Duncan, publisher of Macro Watch. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with the international man, Doug Casey, about how America and much of the world could very well be on the road to a greater depression. You can learn more about Doug at internationalman.com. Doug, you mentioned the centrally planned economy and how America has drifted toward more and more of that as we try to control these high prices. Interest rates have now been hiked up. The Fed tried to raise rates in 2019, and they only got that federal funds rate up to about 2.5%. And you can kind of think of this as the base rate that other interest rates are based off of. And they only got them up to about 2.5% before they had to reverse course because markets were crashing. Well, now we've begun to raise rates again recently from 0. We've got the federal funds rate up to about 1%. So I guess what I'm getting at in this centrally planned economy, as we move from quantitative easing and printing dollars over to quantitative tightening and destroying dollars, where does that leave the Fed between a rock and a hard place here? How high can they bring rates up? Are they ever going to be able to get on top of inflation? Something's got to give. What are your thoughts with the Fed actions, Doug?
They can't hike rates very high because there's so much debt in American society today that if interest rates go higher, it's going to result in lots of defaults on the part of individuals, on the part of companies, on the part of the U.S. government, for that matter. Right now, the U.S. government is paying an average interest rate of about 2% or $600 billion per year. If it goes up to 6%, well, forget about 10%, forget about 15%, where it was back in 1980, the U.S. government is going to be manifestly bankrupt at that point. They can't raise rates, they can't lower rates, but rates are going up anyway, because as I've said, the trillions of dollars of bonds in the market, people that hold them are going to start dumping them. They're going to panic. Interest rates fluctuate directly, or I should say inversely, with bond prices. So there's no way out. They painted themselves into a corner. They're like these ducks in this print you see on the wall in back of me. It's called The Death of Marxism. A couple of ducks have painted themselves into a corner with red ink. That's exactly where the Fed is today. It's exactly where the U.S. government is today, which itself is already bankrupt. But They're like Wile E. Coyote that's jumped off the cliff, that's walking on air.
Part of the math there is you, the viewer, the listener, you can always go to usdebtclock.org. Right now, you'll see that the United States has more than $30 trillion in debt. Doug just told us that we have a 2% interest rate that we're paying, and that is the $600 billion figure that he came up with. And by the way, that $30 trillion in U.S. debt, that translates, which you can learn again over there as well at usdebtclock.org, to $250,000 in debt per taxpayer is what that comes down to. So you can begin to see how vulnerable this entire system is with this centrally planned economy. Doug, most people are only used to this centrally planned economy where the Federal Open Market Committee determines the interest rate. So if we did away with that, a lot of people wonder how that would look. Would we have a federal funds rate, or I guess it might even be called something else, but would that just float with the market somehow rather than being centrally planned?
You can get away with stupidity for years and years. Look at the Soviet Union. It got away with a completely dysfunctional system for 70 years, but then it just collapsed. So I'm not saying that the US government is anywhere near as bad as the Soviet government, but we're walking in that direction. The US resembles the old Soviet Union more and more and more. It's going to end badly.
So people wonder how that would actually look. How would a Greater Depression play out in the United States? How could that affect the everyday citizen? How would that look?
The average guy, if he saves money, and most don't save money, but if he saves money, he saves in dollars. Unfortunately, his dollars are being destroyed at the rate of 10 to 15% per year,
right?
And he's getting maybe 1% in interest at his bank. This is one way that the standard of living of the average guy is collapsing. Second thing is that a lot of people have HR 10s or pensions, things of this nature, but these things are being hammered with the collapse of the bond market and the continuing collapse of the stock market. So they're not going to get what they thought was there either. Third thing is a lot of people rely on Social Security, but Social Security was always a Ponzi scheme from the very beginning. And when we were talking about the $600 billion that the US government's paying in interest, that's only the tip of the iceberg because they have all kinds of undisclosed liabilities. For instance, if the banks fail, the FDIC has limited assets to bail out the banks. It could be hundreds of billions of dollars or more. The Federal Pension Guarantee Corporation could be liable for hundreds of billions of failed pensions. Saying that we've got $30 trillion of debt, that's actually dishonest accounting. It's probably more like $150 trillion of debt.
And how does a Greater Depression play out on the consumer level? Will an American be able to get adequate things like natural gas for heating and electricity and sufficient food?
Everything the government in Washington is doing is counterproductive to a high standard of living in the U.S. They're trying to regulate and control things, and they continue printing up more money to try to keep the ball rolling. Frankly, I don't see any way out of this. Trends in motion tend to stay in motion until they hit a brick wall, reach a crisis. And at that point, anything can happen. We're heading towards a brick wall crisis soon. I'm not talking a decade from now. I'm talking much sooner than that.
I'm thinking about if inflation runs away, would the government institute price controls, which basically don't incentivize anyone to produce anything if producers can't get above a certain price for it? Is that part of what we're talking about here?
Yes, exactly. The problem is these people in Washington have power, and they believe that they have to do something, use their power. So yes, they'll put price controls on things, which discourages production. The best cure for high prices, incidentally, is high prices. High prices in an area mean that producers produce more. But in a highly regulated society that we're in today, it's hard to produce anything. It's hard for builders to build houses to make up for the housing shortages we have. The problem is that trends in motion tend to stay in motion. And this trend is accelerating towards an actual economic catastrophe. The trend in motion is moving towards hitting a brick wall, and it's going to be ugly, and it's going to happen soon.
Then we wonder how one can best protect themselves, what kind of actions we can take if we're trending toward a greater depression. And these could be, for example, kinetic items like starting a garden or building and maintaining a greenhouse, or more passive things like investing passively in food or energy or housing, or classic inflation hedges like gold or even Bitcoin. What are some of those things that a person can do?
All of those things that you mentioned are wise, and I do all of them. Unfortunately, the average guy is being forced to become a speculator. He's being forced to try to second guess the markets to figure out how he can stay ahead of things. And most people are not very good at being a speculator, so it's not going to end well. People trying to outrun the inflation of Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. And that didn't end well either for Germans as individuals or the country as a whole. What I think is going to happen is somebody will come along, some glib politician will say in 24, look, I can solve all this. Just give me adequate power. We're going to elect a man on a white horse, type of thing we see here in South America a lot. Then it gets worse. So what should you do? The things you mentioned, have a garden, smart. Pay off high interest rate debt, smart. Take out long-term fixed interest rate mortgage while interest rates on mortgages are still reasonable. Not do that. What do you do with the money from your mortgage? I think you're okay buying gold. Gold is a reasonable value today. I'd say buy silver coins, put them away. As far as other things are concerned, the stock market and the bond market are poison. Although I'm in the stock market and bond market personally all the time, I think people should look at oil stocks right now. These big oil companies are very mismanaged, and they're very into ESG and diversity, inclusion, and equity stuff. Yesterday, I bought a bunch of shares in Petrobras, the Brazilian national oil company. It has a 20% dividend yield, selling at 4 times earnings, and I think oil is going higher. There are opportunities. Listen, we're on the Titanic, and it's basically rearranging deck chairs for most people.
Food, energy, and housing classically are a lot of those areas where people invest in times of great uncertainty and the potential for recession or maybe even a greater depression like Doug's been talking about here. Yeah, Doug, I've made the point with our audience here before that in times of high inflation, the everyday worker consumer kind of has 2 jobs. Their first job is their day job, and then their second job is learning how to be an investor or speculator to get rid of that dollar that they earned before it loses purchasing power and get out of that dollar that they just worked for.
You're absolutely correct, Keith. And this is a time right now when it's still possible voluntarily cut back on your standard of living so that you still control it, as opposed to waiting for bad things to happen when your standard of living is going to be cut back for you, whether you like it or not. Now's a good time to try to earn more and cut back your standard of living against what's coming in the near-term future.
Well, Doug, do you have any last thoughts as we potentially trend toward this greater depression before I ask our audience how they can learn more about you? Go ahead and wrap it up for us. There's a lot there.
There's really nothing cheap in the world today. The capital that you have should be allocated towards the best bargains in relative terms. And if you want stocks, you should buy oil stocks, coal stocks, uranium stocks. And as far as personal possessions, you should own as many gold and silver coins as you can put aside for safety, for prudence, for insurance. You should educate yourself, learn actual economics, and learn the techniques of being a speculator. That'll come in very handy as the markets are going up and down like an elevator with a lunatic at the controls, because that's the case today. And to diversify yourself politically. If you can't get a second crib outside of the U.S. or your native country, wherever that is, at least move from a place like California to Nevada, which is an improvement tax-wise and regulation-wise. So you can do things like that.
Yeah, more and more Americans are heads up about moving to a certain state for that regulatory arbitrage. Well, I first met Doug Casey in person at the New Orleans Investment Conference a number of years ago. And Doug has really been educating audiences, especially from an international perspective, on economics and liberty and freedom and a whole lot of important things to help improve your quality of life. So, Doug, if someone wants to engage with your resources and learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, go to internationalman.com. We've got lots of really good articles there. It's a free site. Do that. Go to my podcast, which is Doug Casey's Take on YouTube. And I think probably most important, you'll really enjoy the novels that I've written, Speculator, Drug Lord, and Assassin. There are more to come, but don't fall behind because they're a hell of a good read. And they explain all of these things in the form of fiction.
Doug Casey, thanks for sharing your wisdom. It's been great having you back on the show.
Appreciate it, Keith.
Yeah, it's good to get the bigger picture perspective. Sometimes Doug feels that future real estate prices could be in question. Well, even if appreciation completely stopped in the future, you can still lock in pretty low mortgage interest rates today, just not as low as they once were, and you can rent that property to others with persistently high inflation debasing your debt for you all along. I brought up price controls in our chat today, which is when the government steps in and says something like, oh no, gas station, you absolutely cannot charge more than, say, $6 per gallon for gasoline. Or no, leaf lettuce grower, you cannot charge more than $4 for a 1-pound bunch of leaf lettuce. Well, that ceiling, that price control, that's often led to disastrous consequences for economies and for everyday people. Prices often got high in the first place because there was a relative scarcity of those goods. Well, then if you put a price control on, say, leaf lettuce, well, then producers are less incentivized to produce. They're not going to produce at a loss. So when producers stop producing, there's even less reason for anyone to produce the item, making it even more scarce, making your consumer choices more narrow and making your life worse. Price controls can turn out to be a form then of austerity. Then there's more direct austerity programming, which is analogous to saying that you cannot run your air conditioner below 80 degrees in order to conserve electricity, say. Well, that direct austerity measure, that obviously reduces your quality of life, and that's also politically unpopular. See, a politician, say a president, they don't want to institute a direct austerity measure like electricity conservation. So a price control then has more political expediency than austerity does, but it can still have the same drastic result, reducing your consumer choice and diminishing your quality of life. If you picked up on what Doug was saying, he said that you can save, but don't save in dollars. Saving in dollars guarantees a diminishment of your purchasing power. My take is that saving in dollars guarantees a loss in you and your family's standard of living. So the best way to avoid a greater depression at home for yourself is to be vigilant that inflation flips money upside down, get out of dollars, and get into real assets and debt. And we've built a resource right here at GRE to help you do exactly that with our plan. Get out of dollars and get into real assets and good debt all at the same time at gremarketplace.com. That's where you get connected with the best real estate markets and proven providers of income property with real physical addresses that you can buy and reserve for yourself. So just create one login, one time, and connect with providers right there at gremarketplace.com and get started. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.